Welcome to A Deeper Dive. We've created this podcast to explore ideas and trends for the new era of business. We'll strip away the hype, eliminate the buzzwords, and focus on giving you a clear understanding and some knowledge that you can use in the real world. Each program is broken into 5 segments, exploring the concept, how it works, and at least 2 use cases from real-world experience. The final segment in each series focuses on how you can get started and leverage the concept in your day-to-day business. We also have a website where you can find links, references, and other additional info at www.deeperdive.tech or on itworldcanada.com, where you can also sign up for our newsletter and resource guides. This series is sponsored by Wipro Canada, who offer end-to-end best practice solutions that help Canadian businesses and communities. Our hosts are
Jim Love, I'm the CIO of IT World Canada and the author of Digital Transformation in the First Person.
And I'm Doug Sparks from the University of Waterloo's Conrad School of Entrepreneurship and Business.
And now, the 4th episode in our series on scenario planning, case study number 2.
In our last episode, we started to develop some of the global scenarios. And now, our task is to take this to where the rubber hits the road. We need to take these to specific scenarios. We need to find those that scenarios that develop options and strategies. This was critical to Walk. He said, a strategy should always be a concept for changing the existing competitive advantage. And if not, you know it's not a real strategy.
And if you want to look at competitive positioning and you need a framework.
Michael Porter.
Yes.
High five. The genius of Porter. And before we geek out on this, give us a Porter primer. Michael Porter, 5 forces, 30 seconds.
30 seconds.
Now.
Okay. So when you're looking at Porter's 5 forces model, you have to ask, how do different forces affect companies competitively? And so in Porter, if you imagine sort of at the center of his model, there's the industry itself, the competition, the rivalry is a very price competitive, cutthroat pricing, all that kind of stuff. And so, it gives you an idea of the general layout of it. Is it a lot of small competitors or is it a monopoly? And then we looked at the sort of the power relationships of suppliers and customers for the next 2 forces in his model.
Yeah, and he looked at entrance to the market. So you get those first 2 forces or first 3 forces you talked about. The competition, and he really believed that competition was a great thing. That it was intense competition was great for making you better in a market. And he looked at suppliers and customers in there, but he also looked at 2 areas: the new entrants, and that's a pretty easy one. The 4th force is new entrants to the market. You got to watch out for those. But the real genius, and this is what I love about Porter, he had this idea of a substitute.
Yeah.
So, and that brings us right around to 3D printing. If there's, you can't find a better example of a substitute for conventional manufacturing than 3D printing. So, if that's a plausible scenario, Doug, what happens?
Well, that's a really interesting question. So let's look at some of the secondary drivers that are prevalent in manufacturing. While the global trends we discuss set the context, they influence the overall environment, the secondary trends have influence on the operational environment. And rather than environment, I often like to think of this as the architecture of the industry, how all the different players are related to each other. So in some jurisdictions, as we talked about in the last episode, we're seeing the right to repair in legislation coming out. And this creates a potential need for access to spare parts. So in terms of Porter, this changes the relationship between suppliers and customers. And so how is that shifting the architecture of the industry? Then in terms of competition,
if you take your suppliers, Doug, in there, if you can print your own parts, doesn't that have a major impact on the power of your suppliers?
Yeah, I mean, you're changing, as I say, you're changing the architecture. You're weakening a relationship in one area and strengthening it in another one. So, it shifts that architecture. And many times this shifting architecture can create sort of unrealized competitive advantages. And in terms of competition, it also has the potential to really to shorten the design build development cycle for new products. And it also allows a greater degree of customization for products. So you have this situation where you can start moving away from sort of economies of scale and start moving towards economies of scope. And what I like to refer to as competitive agility in the industry. So you're able to react very quickly to changes in the marketplace.
You didn't trademark that, economies of scope? That's good.
Yeah, you like that? No, I have to admit I got it from somewhere else, but it's the basic idea.
From Harvard?
No, not from Harvard. Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So anyway, back to COVID. Yeah.
So So COVID has really had so many different impacts on how things are evolving. I mean, COVID has driven us to a sudden movement towards working from home, and initially this was kind of perceived as a short-term anomaly. Now it's beginning to appear as a potential change in the social context. You see more and more, people wanting to work from home.
Yeah, it certainly is. People aren't going back. I mean, I'm never going back to the office. It's just not going to happen. I think it won't be the same as everybody thinks, that everybody's going to suddenly be out of the office. But I think it's going to change the dynamic of the office in there.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, especially for sort of the quote unquote knowledge workers. You can, and it's not even just work from home; it's work from anywhere. Why not take advantage of that? So it's definitely sort of now that we know it's there, it's going to be hard to undo it. And this has changed the relationship with employees. An architectural shift in the organization. And how? So you can ask the question: well, how does this impact manufacturing? And what it's done is created increasing reliance on IT infrastructure, and has shifted components of the organization's operations, like admin, procurement, that kind of stuff, to become virtual. And this is important because the ice has been broken, right? It doesn't take a lot of imagination to start to think about, well, what's the next thing that we can make virtual? And you couple this with issues like increased concern about supply chain resilience, geopolitical issues, especially around trade that are changing contextual issues. And IT has made it possible now to consider distributed manufacturing. And this is sort of cloud-enabled, decentralized manufacturing. And this can have so many implications. Things like, we go back to right to repair. It impacts warehousing, transportations. Transportation is, especially in terms of climate change, is going to be increasingly important and possibly a regulatory issue, right? So,
and harder to find. Believe it or not, this is going to fall into one of those. It's harder and harder to find people who want to drive trucks anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. And then you have the whole self-driving trucks, all this kind of stuff coming into play. So again, other issues coming into to set the context. And then you add on to that the ability it provides for customization and rapid response to customer demand, right? Not just volume, but I want something specialized. Before, it's like the old thing, you can have the car any color you want as long as it's black. Well, that's no longer acceptable, right? You can, if I want something customized, you want to be able to offer it. You take that and couple that sort of distributed manufacturing idea with additive manufacturing and the expansion of the gig economy and this idea of just-in-time or on-demand manufacturing. This becomes a real possibility. I mean, Gardner, in their 2024 outlook, they talked about one of the strategic trends as the democratization of expertise. And this has changed the nature of how people relate to the business. If I want access to expertise, I can go out and more easily get access to it. So imagine design and engineering as a service. I could go out and as an organization, why do I keep designers on staff when I can go out and hire them on a sort of a contractual basis or as required? And so this is another key trend.
Yeah. So again, we got this started in there. You can see the evolution from the global sort of big impact scenarios, and they never really they're always related. But you take them into these individual impacts in the competitive position of your company and where you're going. And if you work with something like the Porter's model, I think you can start to see how you can build a detailed description and build into some of these detailed scenarios.
Yeah, absolutely.
So just to sum up in this, we've dealt with this we started with a technological global phenomena, 3D printing. We looked at the related drivers because it's often a number of forces where we get the real impact. Walk talks about rain, but when you get warm ocean air and it rises and it hits cooler air, it starts a hurricane, not merely a flood. And I think we're talking about these types of events where you get multiple things going together. You get hurricanes, not just flooding. And so how do you look for these specific drivers and global drivers? Well, you can use a framework. Now, for global ones, we looked at PESTLE: political, economic, social, technological, legal, environmental.
Yeah, and then we look at these secondary drivers in the light of how they work for our competitive position. For that, frameworks such as the Porter 5 forces lets us look at how these drivers affect the architecture of our industry and our competitive position within it. So aspects such as the power relationships between with customers and suppliers, and even now with employees, and how they impact barriers to entry for new competitors and the cost of substitutes for our products and services. And this is where we can see the impact and start to feed our scenarios. Take these to a possible future and use backcasting, which we will talk about in our next episode, putting it into practice.
One last thing to remember. It just has to be plausible. You want to reperceive, break out of functional fixedness, imagine plausible futures, and then understand the drivers of those futures.
Yeah.
Develop the scenarios to deal with them and find some real options.
Absolutely.
So we've asked my friend Amit Majithia from Wipro Canada to give us some examples of how companies that Wipro has worked with have met unexpected and devastating challenges to their business. Now, not surprisingly, we didn't have to look far for the challenges. With the pandemic out there, we can see that it's taken a real toll on companies. Now, these companies that Amit's going to talk about give us a way to see real events and their impact. And now, we're not saying they had formal scenario planning or that they got it right in all that instances, but they did have one thing in common. They looked at the future and they saw that companies needed to plan for the disruption of a digital future. So welcome, Amit.
Thank you, Jim. It's a real pleasure to talk to you and connect with you again.
There's another company you've been working with as well. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So this is a major energy player in Canada, and one of the things that we were working with them before the pandemic was how to bring design-led agile approaches in terms of the way they work and innovation-led agile sort of initiatives. As you know, when the pandemic struck, so just to give you a scenario, just before the pandemic, they have what we call maintenance engineers who go around to look at various critical aspects of a broken pipeline or gas leaks and so on. So there's about 4,500 maintenance engineers who go around doing this, and there's about 1 million work orders in a given year to try and fix some of these. And on top of that, you'd have auditors. They have around 100 auditors who sort of make sure whatever the maintenance work that's been done by the engineers, they have to inspect them and make sure from a regulatory perspective that these jobs are done in a safe and secure way. So, one of the things we were working with them prior to the pandemic was in terms of field services. How do we help them in terms of, again, putting the field engineers, both the people doing the maintenance as well as the auditors, and how can those field engineers as well as the auditors have a different experience in terms of the way they do field maintenance? Through the design-led approach was different scenarios that could potentially happen, and how can they make the job a lot more, as you mentioned about the future-proofing it. Can they make the operational efficiency a lot better from a customer experience perspective or user experience perspective. When COVID struck, one of the things that really happened was these auditors, the hundreds of auditors, they were in a way, a bit reluctant to get out onto the field. They started feeling nervousness, like you and I, when we were restricted in our lockdowns, and a lot of these people felt, very reluctant to get out, and that started causing a backlog of various audits that were not being done. And one of the things that the company came, this large energy company came to us and said, look, when you come up with some of these suggestions of addressing this challenge that we're going through, where auditing is not being done. So one of the things that we looked at is three or four options that can be done straight away to address this challenge. And as a result, one of the ones that was selected was using, again, an AR/VR technology, which is a RealWare technology with Microsoft Teams, where the auditors were able to, through working from home or secure places, were able to connect with the field engineers who would be wearing these helmets, what they call the safety helmets they wear on a normal day-to-day basis. But this time, it's attached with a camera, an ability to connect back to the auditors. So they were able to show the auditors exactly the type of work they were doing, and the auditors were able to see that, and then, from a safe distance, be able to make sure that these audits can be completed from the safety of their home. So that was the scenario that I went through. But as I think, just like the previous example, it was because of the fact that both organizations felt, as you mentioned, the digital innovation technologies was a way to make sure future-proof their business and make sure that, and if there are scenarios like this, they can quickly be agile enough to bring solutions that will help those challenges that are coming up for them.
Yeah. And I think we've talked about him from Royal Dutch Shell, who was the father of all of the scenario planning that we use corporately, would be proud of this, because it focuses on a couple of things. One is it takes a look at the future, yes, but it also proposes practical scenarios and solutions that can be used in real life. I think this is fabulous.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think the important thing is to have that collaborative nature. So one of the things that we feel was very important was to have some sort of trust, to build a trust between both the clients that we're working with and them to see trust in us as a partner that can bring the technological expertise that companies like Wipro has. That when that collaborative framework is set in place, and you can start to see and pilot various things, and when scenarios like this occur, it's important then to know that, yes, you've got the ability to quickly act in the scenarios and bring those solutions that will make a difference to the business straight away.
Absolutely. And I think that's the essence of scenario planning. Look at things, do things differently, embrace partners, bring new people in, bring new vision, bring new ideas, bring new future-looking people into this equation, so that you can really start to plan effectively for the future, an unknown future, certainly a disruptive one, but also you can find ways to execute strategies quickly. It's a perfect win-win for everyone in there. Amit, I want to thank you for this. This has been great. It gives us some good concrete examples of use cases that people can start to think about as they start to plan how they're going to be doing scenario planning. So once again, my guest has been Amit Majithia from Wipro Canada. Thanks again, and hope to see you in person real soon.
Likewise, Jim. It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to having a coffee and even a dinner with you sometime, hopefully very soon.
That's a scenario we can plan for. Thanks
Absolutely.
a lot.
Yeah.
In our last episode, we'll give you a starter's guide to getting going with scenario planning in your company. Each of these episodes will also be available in text, and we'll publish some key tools and resources. You'll find this on itworldcanada.com/deeperdive or at the podcast site deeperdive.tech. That's deeperdive.tech. This series is sponsored by Wipro Canada, who offer end-to-end best practice solutions that help Canadian businesses and communities. See you next time. I'm James Roy.